You're listening to the Fed and Fearless podcast. On today's episode, I'm chatting with Julie Sawaya, the co-founder of Needed, about what to look for in a prenatal and how to make sure that you're getting all the nutrients that you need both before, during, and after pregnancy. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm your host, Laura Schoenfeld, a registered dietitian, nutrition business coach, and online entrepreneur with over 10 years of experience in online business. And I'm here to show you everything I've learned about creating a life and a business that nourishes you. On this podcast, we'll talk about the lifestyle habits, practical strategies, mindset shifts, and leaps of faith required to build a healthy body, a powerful mind, a strong spirit, and a successful business. Hey there, and welcome back to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm your host, Laura Schoenfeld, and we have another prenatal conversation happening today, which was not necessarily intentional in terms of, the particular stage of life that I'm in. But it seems to be the topic that just keeps falling into my lap lately. And I'm always excited to talk about it. It's something that I've always been passionate about, even before getting pregnant and now being pregnant myself. Certainly is something I'm thinking a lot more about lately. Now, one thing I want to give you guys a heads up about with this episode is that during the recording process, my mic was having a very, very difficult time staying connected to Zoom. So there's probably going to be some weird parts where my audio drops out or the audio changes. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up. I think Julie's audio is pretty good, so I'm not too worried about you being able to hear all of the great information that she has to share. But as far as my audio quality is concerned, it's definitely something I was struggling with a lot. But as you guys know, tech challenges happen and the show must go on. So I'm hoping that this will still be a super valuable episode for you, especially with all of the incredible information that Julie has to share. So my guest today is Julie Sawaya. Julie is the co-founder of Needed along with Ryan Woodbury. They founded a perinatal nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment before, during, and after pregnancy. As fellow nutrition nerds and mamas-to-be, they were shocked to realize that they were super deficient in key prenatal nutrients. They dug into the research and realized they were far from alone. Most prenatal vitamins are designed to meet bare minimum needs, leaving mama deficient after giving so much to growing a healthy baby. So that's why Julie and Ryan started Needed, to match their needs and that of every woman before, during, and after pregnancy. So Needed is one of the companies that I personally use as far as prenatal nutrition is concerned. I definitely mix things up. I don't take the same product every single day. I don't know if there's a specific reason for that. I think it could be because the Needed product is a powder and there's certain days that I want to have a powder and then other days that I don't. And so if I'm going to use a powder, the Needed powder is what I use. And if I use capsules, at this point, I have some other products that I've had in my arsenal for a while now that I've been using. But I love the formula that Needed has. And the powder is something that definitely helped me through a lot of those times where taking pills was really difficult. So, and I actually this morning used the powder instead of the capsule type for my prenatal. So I love their products. And I was really excited to have Julie come on the show to talk about them and to talk about prenatal nutrition in general and to make sure that every woman listening has the opportunity to nourish themselves appropriately, both leading into pregnancy, during pregnancy, and after pregnancy, which are all times of a woman's life that we need a lot more nutrients than ever before. So I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you will as well. And without further ado, here is Julie Sawaya. All right, everybody. Well, I am so excited to have with us on the show today, Julie Sawaya. Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And we've had a few conversations about pregnancy, prenatals, all this stuff that it just so happens to very much align with the stage of life that I'm in myself. And so I was super excited when I got to connect with you to come and talk about prenatals, being the creator of a prenatal company. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing your story with our audience so they can get to know you better and hear about what led you to start a prenatal supplement company in the first place?
So I grew up in a family of medical doctors, nurses and MDs. And from a really young age, my dad, who's a doctor, was diagnosed with diabetes. And really, I think from the time I was 5 at the time, and I think from a very, very early age to me, there was a disconnect between the doctor being the least healthy person in my family. And that really led me down a path of wanting to understand preventative health and wellness, and nutrition, quickly emerged as such an important foundational part of that. In undergrad, I studied economics, but my passion for nutrition and food led me down the path of really understanding food deserts, areas that are underserved geographically by access to healthy food. And although I didn't pursue working on food deserts professionally, it was something that I was really passionate about, that question of food access and nutrition access. And that experience really helped me to understand how much education matters for access. It's, first of all, of course, there's geographic or there can be income considerations, but also education and helping people understand the importance of quality nutrition is so vitally important. So that all, I think, was several years in the distance before Needed came into being. I met my co-founder, Ryan, when we were both business school students at Stanford, and both of us had worked in finance, but had in our own free time pursued nutrition certifications and really nerded out on all things nutrition. And we're doing what we thought were the right things, like shopping at the farmer's market and preparing a lot of our own food. And through really our shared interest in nutrition, we probably egged each other on a little to do nutrient testing. At the time, it was like just becoming available to do at-home nutrient testing. And through that process, rather shockingly, that we had huge nutritional deficiencies that we were really surprised to have because of how intentional we were about our diet, and also knowing the importance of taking supplements, especially in the prenatal or preconception time period. At the time, we were both, I would say, preconception. So we knew kids were on the horizon, but it wasn't imminent for us. But all of our friends who were not in business school were starting families, and a lot of them were struggling with fertility or with pregnancy complications or symptoms, or just having like a really less than optimal postpartum experience. And so the combination of Ryan and I realizing we were deficient, and then seeing how underemphasized nutrition was in the perinatal journey. Of course, most women are told to take a prenatal, and they're usually pretty compliant with that. Research shows 97% of women do take a prenatal, but 95% have nutrient deficiencies. So Ryan and I were far from alone. And it really doesn't matter if you're, eating as balanced as you possibly can. It's just a function of our modern food system that food alone isn't cutting it. And most prenatal vitamins are designed to fill in the minimum gaps, really not to set women up for optimal health. So that's really kind of the founding story of Needed. We kind of stumbled into the problem ourselves and discovered what a widespread issue it was. And I think, at the time I had nieces and nephews, and I'd been an aunt for more than half of my life, which is awesome. And I've always wanted to have kids. And I think the perinatal stage is so interesting because it really impacts not only a child's health for the rest of their life, but also a mother's health for the rest of her life. And it's just such a passion area for me that I get so excited to, help to solve the problem. And there's so many problems around prenatal nutrition, but I think several key ones are generally products are under meeting women's needs. The education is really hard to come by. And, oftentimes women are relying on OBs or midwives who have maybe some nutrition training, but generally not nearly as much as a registered dietitian or a naturopathic doctor. And not all women have access to an RD or a naturopathic doctor to help them figure out what they need. So we're really trying to solve both the products and the educational gap at Needed.
Mm-hmm. And I hate to say this, but having been trained as a registered dietitian, and I have a master's in public health, and I think even comparing your product to a lot of what's out there, your product has so much more of the things that either they're not talked about when it comes to prenatal nutrition, or, there's even some nutrients that people are afraid of, like vitamin A as an example. And So even if somebody's seeing a dietitian, that doesn't guarantee that they're actually getting any sort of education about what makes an appropriate prenatal. And I think there's a lot of controversy about that, even in the dietetic space. So just the fact that you have access to a healthcare provider doesn't actually mean that you're getting the best information, unfortunately. And actually, that leads me to kind of a follow-up question. Again, because I've been aware of your product probably closest since it came out. I forget exactly how I ran across it, but it was one of the products I was like keeping in my rotation for my clients and for myself. Because I was taking a prenatal probably about a year before getting pregnant. But I'm just curious if there was any particular influences that helped you and Ryan determine some of these nutrient inclusions in the product that, again, are not necessarily typical. It's not like you're just kind of following suit with all the other companies out there. So how did you actually come across this particular formulation as being the one to focus on?
Yeah, it was really a multi-year process, which I think is really uncommon, especially in the place that we sit, which is direct to consumer supplements. It's really common for, companies to innovate on branding or on packaging and leave product formulations untouched. White labeling, which is basically taking a formulation that already exists and then changing the branding on it, is so common. And, for sure, the easiest path to market is not the one that we took. It was multiple years of vetting basically every single nutrient, both the optimal dosage, the optimal form, nutrient interactions, and then, sourcing every single ingredient from the top supplier across the globe. And we didn't do it alone. So I would say the process was really partnering from a very early stage with perinatal nutrition and health practitioners that are testing women's nutrient and hormone levels day in and day out before, during, and after pregnancy. We knew that this was a super critical step because there's several problems with prenatal nutrition standards. One being that oftentimes official guidelines lag behind the clinical research. So starting with the clinical research is great. And there's a lot out there. And we certainly started there. But then there's some, pretty meaningful gaps in women's health research, especially around the perinatal stage, because of the difficulty of running double-blind, placebo-controlled studies on pregnant women. And so we really filled in those research gaps with the in-practice experience of our practitioner base. And that practitioner base is broad. It includes OBs, it includes midwives, RDs, NDs, as we spoke about earlier. And we really think that breadth and diversity is what sets Needed apart. And it's what led to our formulations being so distinct from the vast majority of what you see on the market.
Yeah, like I said, there's only a few products that I actually feel comfortable with, both for myself and for any clients that I have worked with in the past. And, there's certain products that are extremely popular when it comes to the consumer market. But when you look at them, you're like, this is missing a substantial number of nutrients. How is this something that's even going to help a woman get what they need, especially knowing what I know about very typical deficiencies that women are having? So all of that.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of I was just going to add a fun anecdote on that. Like when we first launched, we almost had some skepticism from some practitioners who were so used to seeing these shiny direct to consumer companies come out with this like beautiful branding, but the product quality not living up to the standard. So, sometimes we would lead rather than with the packaging or with our website with like our supplement facts panel. And I think that, when you're trained on what to look for in a prenatal, I think that's really where the aha moment came for a lot of practitioners. It's like, wow, this is a brand that's really compelling, but the product quality is there. And from the very beginning, Ryan and I were super focused on and it's actually how we came up with the name Needed. We kind of stumbled into it because we kept going back to like, we're trying to solve actual needs. We're not just trying to launch another product. Like the world doesn't need another prenatal vitamin. It needs a prenatal vitamin that is completely redesigned and to actually meet women's needs. So I think it's been fun to see the reception of the product by consumers and practitioners, but definitely kind of a funny experience of initial skepticism based on the branding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talk about a crowded marketplace as far as like prenatal supplements are concerned. And if you were going to just replicate what everybody else is doing, it probably would have not been a very smart business model, let alone something that was actually valuable for people. So it's, I think, a good example of innovation in the market and realizing that, just because there's certain products that people are recommending or using, it doesn't mean that we've reached the peak of performance as far as those products are concerned. So for those listening, I know we have a mix of audience members, some general public and a lot of practitioners, dietitians, nutritionists, that kind of thing. And so whether somebody's a consumer or if they are a practitioner, what would be some things you recommend looking for when choosing a prenatal for yourself or for a client that you would be recommending one to?
So I'd say probably one of the most important things to look for is a product that's utilizing nutrient forms that your body can best utilize. And that, in many cases can mean the most active form. So in the case of folate, vitamin B9, we look to utilize methylfolate, which is the active form. That's the form circulating in blood serum. The much more common and cheap form is folic acid. And, there's a lot of research growing, but this is kind of a good example of a nutrient where the clinical research has advanced farther than the official guidelines, because, official guidelines will still say take folic acid, not the active bioavailable form methylfolate. But we tend to look towards the clinical research and the in-practice experience. And in practice, methylfolate is a highly tolerated form. It's in the format that your body can readily put to work. There's no downsides as with folic acid of, unmetabolized synthetic nutrients flowing through your body. So we look to every single nutrient that's included in our prenatal. We look to what's the form that your body can best utilize, always looking at forms that exist in nature and looking at the underlying mechanism of how the body actually processes them. So that's a key thing. The next one I would say is dosages that really are supportive. And this is where there's a lot of gray area because, so much of the clinical research, some nutrients have a really well-established RDA, like in the case of choline of, pregnancy, it's 450 milligrams. And for postpartum, it's 550 milligrams. And most prenatals aren't coming anywhere near that. They're dosing at 55 milligrams. That's probably the most common dosage you'll see after zero. Many prenatals don't have any. And the reason for that is that certain nutrients like choline are really bulky. So they take up a lot of molecular space. You can't fit them all into a 1-a-day prenatal. So that would be my, really quick litmus test for, is this a high quality prenatal, is looking at if it's a 1-a-day forms and the dosages that are truly optimal, they're just not going to fit into one of those formats. So then the next, kind of key thing to focus on is it something you can take every day? And I think that's where consumers can run into problems because optimal dosages are often a lot of pills. That's one reason why we started with a prenatal multi that's in a powdered form. Powder allows us to dose at like truly optimal levels of every nutrient without the constraints of a capsule. And it's something that you can mix into a smoothie or into a daily latte. And that format works great for many, not for all. So we also have a capsules version of the multi, but it's 8 capsules. It's a lot. I think especially coming from a 1-a-day prenatal, it can feel like a shock, but many women do really, really well on that format by breaking up their dosages between 2 or 3 meals throughout the day. And it feels much more doable. And then I guess the third option, just to highlight that we offer, it's our newest prenatal. It's an essentials multi, which is, I think, probably the best prenatal to try if you are in the first trimester and you have nausea or you're switching from something that is really minimalistic, because it's only 3 capsules and the dosages are really supportive, but they're lower than optimal dosages that are in our powder or capsules format. So it's a really good option for people who are like, there's no way I could ever take 8 capsules. And I get that. I was definitely that consumer a few years back of capsules were hard for me. And with time, I've built up a bit of a tolerance, but it's a really good choice. And I think if the trade-off is between, there's no way I could do an 8 capsule and powder doesn't sound appealing to me, I would suggest looking into a more complete 3 capsule prenatal. And there's a couple others out on the market that are high quality in addition to ours. And then I think something that's really, really important, because the supplements industry is I wouldn't say, I think there's a bit of a fallacy that it's unregulated. It's not unregulated. The FDA does regulate supplements, but they regulate it as food, meaning that there's no pre-approval required for a product to go to market. The FDA really acts through enforcement letter once you're already in market. So if there's a problem with your product once it's already out, the FDA will crack down on you, or if you're making unsubstantiated claims. But there's not a rigorous process of review and certification before coming to market the way there would be with a drug. And so that's where I think third-party testing is so important. And we third-party test every single ingredient and every single finished product batch that we produce for things like nutritional content. So seeing is like, does the label actually match what's in the bottle? That's not always the case. Other things to be concerned about, especially around pregnancy, is heavy metals. And this is a real challenge with food-based prenatals, which I think can be something that's really popular. It sounds awesome to get a nutrient that's totally sourced from the ground. But the problem is oftentimes nutrients that are grown in nature, they tend to accumulate heavy metals from soil. So sometimes it's actually better to use an ingredient that was basically a nutrient form that exists in nature, but that's recreated in a controlled environment in a lab. And so we will often use that kind of nutrient sourcing when there's a real concern with a heavy metal exposure in the natural format. And so third-party testing is super important. You can ask brands about their third-party testing. I would take it a step further and ask them if you could see the third-party testing results. Not every brand will show it to you, but it's a very valid question. And the ones that are comfortable with their third-party testing should have nothing to hide and should be happy to share it with you. So in summary, the 4 things that I would really focus on are the nutrient forms the right ones for your body to best utilize? Does it have complete nutrient dosages? Is it something that you can take every day? And then can you trust the company and what's on the label as being what's in the bottle?
It's so interesting. One of the things you mentioned, and I don't know if you're familiar with this controversy or not, but the part about the folate versus the folic acid, that's been something that I was aware of for, it's got to be at least like 7, 8+ years at this point. Cause I used to work with a man named Chris Kresser, who I don't know if you're familiar with him, but one of the things I helped him do was research for his blog. And that was a really popular blog post that we worked on together, was his folate versus folic acid post. And I remember seeing a pretty popular Instagram OBGYN kind of go off on how...
I think I might know the one.
I was going to say, I don't know what her name is. So the goal isn't to be like disparaging anybody, but I just remember there being some like hoopla in the dietetic space. Like, oh, is it actually better to do folic acid?
I would say like the reason that folic acid continues to be recommended ahead of methylfolate by governing bodies like ACOG and even the CDC. I think it's disappointing that it's the case, but it's good to just be transparent and get right into it. Is, the most of the research on neural tube defects, which is, the original reason to include folate, vitamin B9 in a prenatal, is to avoid neural tube defects. Most of the clinical research looking at neural tube defect prevention is dated from the 80s. And at that time, folic acid was the nutrient form of B9 that was available in supplement form. It was also cheap. There's a huge food industry behind maintaining folic acid as the standard nutrient form. Think about the food forms that you see folic acid in. It's like enriched bread and fortified cereals. And methylfolate is many, many orders of magnitude more expensive than synthetic folic acid. So I think there's definitely that incentive coming into the picture. But I think what we rely on and many of the evidence-based prenatals are relying upon is the clinical research that is looking at what is the actual mechanism of neural tube defect prevention and its maternal folate status. So there's a huge body of research looking at comparing folic acid versus methylfolate and their ability to raise serum folate status. And methylfolate has been shown to be at least as effective as folic acid at doing so. And on the other side, there's also a mounting body of evidence about the negative impacts of unmetabolized folic acid circulating in the body and what that can do to, to a mother or to an unborn fetus. And, you'll find unmetabolized folic acid in just about every adult human sample because of, the excess folic acid that we see in fortified or, packaged foods. So, that plus looking at in the body, what is the format of methylfolate, what is the format of folate that really exists in the body, and seeing that 96+% of it is methylfolate. I think we feel very comfortable that that is a form that our bodies can utilize. It makes so much sense in terms of what's the mechanism of neural tube defect. And I think that's a good example of where looking to nature as well as to science, as well as to in practice experience is really, really important. Not to say that, science and nature are always at odds, but I think, we do tend to look at like what forms do exist in nature, and we prioritize those because we trust that nature is smart and it evolves in the way that has kept, certainly there have been, there's good reason to supplement with folate. I don't want to say that, and I don't want it to be misunderstood that like, we don't need supplementation to prevent neural tube defects. But I would say like, it's a bit nonsensical to think that this man-made synthetic form is the only one that can prevent neural tube defects, since it doesn't exist in nature.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't remember what the exact argument was, because I think it was maybe a year ago that I saw this. Everything that you just said is probably along the lines of what my response was. And it's frustrating because there's already such a lack of good information for women already. And then you get something like that where this person has a huge audience, and she was calling out specific brands that I'm very happily taking myself and recommending. And it just was really bizarre to me. And, I think I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. What concerns me most is not necessarily, are you taking folic acid or are you taking folate? Because there's probably arguments on both sides of valid arguments on both sides of like, okay, well, most of the research on neural tube defects are on folic acid. So taking some folic acid in addition to methylfolate, if you're really nervous, like, I'm not here to say you should never do that. But I think what worries me about that argument is the scare tactics of, kind of scaring women into making a choice. And that particular practitioner, really was going at it from the perspective of fear, I think, and spreading some misinformation. So it's unfortunate. I think our approach is to always educate and empower. And ultimately, that's what we're here to do, is not to tell you that we have the only prenatal on the market, or that we always get everything right. But it's really to present to you here's what we know, here's how we came to the decision, and empowering women to make those decisions for themselves, I think is the piece that's ultimately like the most important out of everything that we're doing, is just empowering women to understand the information themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And being pregnant myself, just knowing like when you're in it, and it's not like you have a ton of time to figure that kind of stuff out, right? It's like, it's happening, there aren't like months where you can just kind of do research, right? So I think the more people can understand going into pregnancy, and then the more when they're in pregnancy, they can just make a decision and then just stick with that decision and not feel like they have to be second guessing everything or being nervous or anything like that, I think is really important. And, what you were saying before about the dosages that you guys put in your product, like I even remember the first trimester, it was really hard for me to do the full dose, both the powder, because I have the kneaded powder, and then I have another product that's an 8 capsule version. And both of those were pretty difficult for me to get in and be comfortable with, because I had a lot of nausea. I wasn't vomiting a ton, but even just the nausea itself was like pretty disruptive. But just being able to kind of do what I could during that first trimester. And then now that I'm in my second trimester and feeling significantly improved compared to a few weeks ago, now I can get back into the full dose of things. And I know, okay, it's like not that big of a deal. I know, the first trimester was a little rough, but we had a guest on recently talking about prenatal nutrition. And we were discussing how even just being able to take these full high quality products that contain everything that we need for up to a year before getting pregnant was really, really helpful for me, because I knew, okay, even with, the very quote unquote like unideal diet that I was eating and my, bare bones supplementation during the first trimester, I knew that all of the nutrient stores I'd built up for months leading up to getting pregnant was going to help get me through that period of time. So I do feel like even if the women listening are not necessarily planning to get pregnant anytime soon, I feel like this conversation is really important for women of any stage of preconception, because I definitely was very glad that I had done all the groundwork before getting pregnant, because, I definitely wasn't going to be making up for lost time in that first 15, 16 weeks.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important point. And I think it's like a very common misconception is that the prenatal is for the baby. And we just got done talking about neural tube defects. So that's a clear example of where, it is an insurance policy for baby. But in the vast majority of cases, baby's going to get exactly what he or she needs. It's often at the expense of maternal nutrient stores. So that's where taking a prenatal is so important. And a lot of, I think our emphasis as a brand is in putting the self-care back into taking a prenatal vitamin, because ultimately it's really for your health as much as for babies, if not more for your health. And on that point, I think, taking a prenatal preconception is a great way to ensure that you start out pregnancy with an abundance of nutrient reserves that you can then draw on, exactly to your point, during the first trimester if you're not feeling so great or if your diet changes. That way you never get to a place of depletion. And it can definitely be easier preconception to be consistent with that routine than in the early weeks of pregnancy. So I'm glad that that was reassuring to you, because we hear that a lot from women. They're really nervous about taking their prenatal. And it's great to take your prenatal every day. I certainly not saying skip it if you can help it. But if you do skip some days or you have to take a reduced dose, it's okay. Knowing that, you took it preconception, you're going to be fine. You're going to have everything you need. And if your diet changes drastically in that first trimester, know that it will rebalance. Even if you are one of the unlucky moms who has hyperemesis throughout your pregnancy, it will end and you will be able to go back to the diet that you had preconception. It's just, that's why I think supplementation is so important.
Yeah, definitely. So I know that there's a couple of myths and misconceptions that you guys like to bust, being an educational brand. And one of the things we kind of touched on this a little bit with the prenatal preconception, but I know you also mentioned taking it post birth, in the postpartum period. And so do you find that a lot of women just are totally unaware that they would want to continue their prenatal after giving birth?
So I think this is changing a little bit, similar to the preconception conversation. And maybe it's that we hang out with a lot of consumers every day who are really they're really educating themselves, and our customers are amazingly nutritionally aware. But I would say, yeah, it is a common misconception that a prenatal is just for pregnancy. Really, it's ideal to start taking your prenatal up to a year before conception, all the way through breastfeeding. And if you don't breastfeed, or if you breastfeed and then stop breastfeeding, keeping up with your prenatal for 6 to 12 months after that is really ideal for getting your nutrient levels back to an optimal place, because it's a lot. And postpartum is actually even more nutritionally demanding than pregnancy is. Whether you breastfeed or not, if you breastfeed, that's exacerbating the demands on your body. But recovering from birth, whether it's vaginal or cesarean, is a lot on the body. And there's a lot you need. Some of them are micronutrients, like what are in a prenatal. Others are, different forms of nutrition, like the amino acids, glycine and proline, which are in our collagen protein. That's why we include collagen in our complete plan, which is what we're really known for, because of how important those amino acids are for birth recovery, for growing the placenta, for, pelvic floor health, for skin stretching, all of that often gets overlooked. And so, yes, absolutely. Our advice for a mom in the third trimester or a new mama is keep taking your prenatal. It really is a great way to ensure that your levels are in an optimal place, or that you don't, dip further into depletion. It's so common. I'm sure you see this in practice. It's so common for women to have hormonal imbalances and other health complications down the road, like autoimmune conditions. And proper nutrition postpartum can really help to set your foundational health for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, collagen is another great example of a nutrient that, or nutritional, I guess it's not really a nutrient, but a nutritional supplementation option that as a dietetic student, I remember there being a lot of people kind of poo-pooing it. And it's ironic. A lot of my listeners know my mom actually is a dietitian as well. And she actually has a book on collagen and why it's so important and how it can affect health. And it was always really interesting to me because in the dietetics education I was in, the argument was that things like proline and glycine are not essential amino acids. You can get plenty of it from your diet and there's no need to supplement. And in theory, that could be true. But then as you're saying, postpartum, there's a much, much higher need for it. And it becomes something that's conditionally essential, which means you actually can't get enough without making an effort to include collagen-rich food or supplements in your diet. So it is really interesting to me, like this stuff, obviously you and I have passion for this and we're staying up to date on these kind of things. And when I think back to, my training, which was a good school, it wasn't like it was, not a good dietetics program, but just as you were saying earlier, there's like a delay of this stuff actually getting into the system, if that makes sense. Like people actually putting this into any sort of recommendations or it trickling down into the educational system for medical professionals. So it is something that I'm very fortunate. I've known about it for probably close to 10 years now, but it is something, it seems like people are getting more savvy about things like collagen, but I'm sure there's still people out there that think it's nonsense. And
yeah. or gross. Like I was a vegan and vegetarian for many years prior to starting my perinatal journey. And the idea of taking collagen sounded like horrifying to me. But what I've realized, exactly to your point, those amino acids, glycine and proline that become conditionally essential during pregnancy, it's just near impossible to get enough of them through a plant-based diet. It's hard enough, eating an omnivore diet because we're often not eating things like the skin on chicken or, we're not eating nose to tail. So for me, it's been a really great addition to my nutrition routine. I feel awesome taking it. I can really feel a difference in terms of my skin and, all of those like vanity type things that have popularized collagen, but it's also just such a great way to get in protein and a complementary form of protein versus what you're typically getting in. Like if I, in early pregnancy, feel too sick to eat eggs, I still find collagen to be really easy to get in protein. And that's one of the most important factors in pregnancy nausea is blood sugar balance. And protein is so essential for that. So it's become a really popular product. And I'm always happy when I can have a conversation with a vegetarian or a vegan mama, and always without judgment, because I totally understand valid reasons for wanting to follow one of those diets. But that can be a really impactful addition to help ensure baby's growing optimally and the placenta is healthy and that you feel great postpartum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember one of the articles I helped with for Chris's website was, I think the title was something like, why even vegetarians need collagen. And I remember the comments were so awful. Like people were so angry. It was like, this isn't vegetarian. It's like, well, yeah, I know, but
that's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was like, we're trying to make this easy for you. Just don't be so angry about it.
Yeah. And, talking about your training, my first nutrition certification was in plant-based nutrition. And so very much the takeaway I had from that is like, we overemphasize the role of protein in the standard American diet and, underemphasize the role of phytonutrients and, animal, just things that you can get through a plant-based diet or a predominantly plant-based diet. And I think there's, probably a good in between for most life stages, but my personal view that's been substantiated by the clinical research and just living and breathing this stuff every day. And my own experience of how I feel is like pregnancy can be a time where making an exception on some of those more restrictive dietary choices can be a helpful way for you to feel really good. And I have a lot of friends who are passionate former vegans who in pregnancy, they'll eat, they actually crave meat. They actually crave collagen or eggs or things like that. And so would just say like, nothing I think needs to be steadfast. What you do during pregnancy doesn't have to be your new normal, but it can be something to focus on. And, you briefly mentioned at the outset, the topic of vitamin A. That's another nutrient where, really the active form of vitamin A that we don't want to get too much of. And that's really where the controversy lies, is in getting too much of it. But what we see in practice is we're falling so far short of too much. We're getting actually not nearly enough. And so, especially those who follow a plant-based diet, because the active form isn't found in plants, it's found in animal-based foods, especially foods like butter or liver or things like that. So anyhow, I think that for me was like part of the evolution with Needed, is understanding how critical some of these nutrients are, and personally feeling so much better when I incorporated them into my diet. And not always, like, I do not eat liver. Kudos to people who do. I think it's awesome. And I see the nutritional role for it, but personally it doesn't appeal. But I think for me, that's where having it in supplement form just makes me feel better than I did before having a more, I guess, comprehensive approach to nutrition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think we mentioned this earlier, but pretty much the vast majority of prenatals have just beta carotene in it, which that's one of the things. If I see that, I'm like, nope, not recommending that product. And so that was one thing I was really pleased with Needed, is that you guys do have the retinol form that makes it available to be used and doesn't have to be converted. And because I'm pretty confident that I'm someone who doesn't convert well, because I've had vitamin A deficiency symptoms before. So that was like immediately something I knew was going to have to be part of any prenatal I recommended. Well, I could probably nerd out with you about prenatal nutrition for a lot longer, but I know that we need to wrap things up. So you have a really awesome guide on just reviewing prenatals and seeing the pros and cons of the different products on the market. So do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about that so they can go grab their copy?
Yeah, absolutely. So this comprehensive guide reviewing 75 of the leading prenatals on the market, it is a crowded market, as we talked about. There's a lot of options out there. And this came about through really an organic, like an Instagram series that we ran, asking customers or followers to write into us with the prenatal that they were taking. And we would have our medical experts review them and share the pros and cons and overall takeaways. And it grew and grew and grew to the point that we had so many brands that were being frequently asked about. So we turned it into a guide. It's a free guide, and you can find it on our website. I think you're going to link the show notes link to that. But yeah, I think it's a great guide. I would say, you can search it alphabetically to find your prenatal. Chances are your prenatal's on there, but if it's not, you can always send us a message, and we have information in the guide on how to do so. But yeah, I think it's a very cool resource that what we hear consistently is women are like, thank goodness, like this is what I've been looking for, is just like an overview comparing all of them in a, as unbiased a way as we can. I think it's, might surprise people when we recommend other prenatals, like, the brand that you've mentioned you were taking. There's a couple others out there that have 8 capsule prenatals, and we think they're great. So, we really do try for this to be just an educational resource that is not overly needed biased. So hopefully your listeners will want to check that out.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes. And whether you're a practitioner or a consumer, it sounds like a super valuable resource. And hopefully we'll get this into the hands of many more OBGYN offices, because I'm pretty sure they didn't have any, and I have a good OBGYN, but I'm pretty sure they don't have any of that information at my office. So, and I don't even know if they asked me what brand I was taking. So, well, anyway, Julie, thank you so much for your time and expertise. It was really great to get to chat with you today and to just be able to pick your brain about prenatals, because again, it's something that's so relevant to my personal life right now. And I know we have a lot of listeners who at some point will, really need to be looking at their prenatal selection as well. So I really appreciate you coming on today.
My pleasure. Absolutely. And I'm sure we could go into this in a full other podcast, but I just wanted to mention, because we talked about preconception and I forgot to mention, men's nutrition really matters in the preconception time period too. So that would be my parting thought is we have some good information on our website, and we also offer a men's line for dad health and for just general preconception health for men. So I think oftentimes the emphasis is put on women too heavily. And in reality, 40% of infertility is male factor, and they are genetically 50% of the health of that embryo. So it's really, and we definitely find men are usually less compliant with taking their supplements than women are. But the good news is nature was intentional and had their involvement be somewhat limited in terms of time period. So that's something to just mention as well that I had meant to flag earlier. But thank you so much for having me on. It's been awesome to be here, and hopefully we'll have a lot more opportunities to collaborate in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely had my husband taking a prenatal for about a year prior to us trying to get pregnant. And I've mentioned this on previous episodes, but we got pregnant first shot basically. And I'm like, all right, I'm sure there's a lot of factors that go into it, but I really believe that part of what helped that happen so quickly was our commitment to nutrition and making sure we were well nourished before even attempting. So now that I'm pregnant, he can do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to take the multi anymore if he doesn't want to, but he still does. So
until next time. Yeah. What we hear from men though is like they feel a real energy difference in taking a high quality multi and the other products in the lineup. So, he can probably less pressure to keep doing so, but he might actually feel some of the benefits. So
yeah. He's pretty compliant. So it wasn't like a battle, but it was definitely something I was more concerned about leading up to getting pregnant than now. I'm more worried about myself because I'm the incubator.
Yeah, totally. So. Until baby's here, and then you're both going to be needing that energy boost and that immunity and all of that. So
yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to you guys for hanging out with us. We'll see you here next week on the Fed and Fearless podcast. Take care, everyone.
Are you a nutritionist or dietitian struggling to figure out how much to charge for your programs and services? Maybe you've heard that as a nutritionist, you should just charge what you're worth. But this way of thinking can cause you to either undercharge your clients or work yourself into the ground trying to earn your worth. As a healthcare provider, you can't set up a pricing structure that forces you to sacrifice your own health and well-being in the name of your business and your clients. But I promise it doesn't have to be this way. When you download my free profit planning workbook, I'll walk you step by step through the 10-step process for determining the right pricing for your nutrition business. As a nutritionist, you have the power to completely change someone's life for the better. There's huge value in that, so it's time to stop underselling what you do. By following along with this worksheet, you can determine exactly what you need to charge to achieve your revenue goals with ease. I'll teach you everything I've learned about pricing from growing my own nutrition business to over $250,000 in revenue annually and helping other dietitian and nutrition entrepreneurs hit their first $10,000 to $30,000 months and beyond. To get your free workbook, go to lauraschoenfeld.com/profit, PROFIT, and grab your copy today, so you no longer have to wonder how to set the right rates for your incredibly valuable nutrition services. That's lauraschoenfeld.com/profit. It's time to make the money that you deserve as a nutritionist, and I can't wait to help you get there.